Well, West Virginia is still struggling with portal madness. We look at the latest from those country roads while also discussing some college basketball returnees who could boost their draft stock for 2024.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, and today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Bird Dogs. So go to birddogs.com/LockedOnCollege, and when you enter the promo code LockedOnCollege, they will throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. All right, folks, joined today by the great Leif Thulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board, regular contributor here on Locked On College Basketball. And Leif, we are 1 week removed from the 2023 NBA draft, but already we are going to look ahead to the 2024 draft, specifically talking about guys who returned to school and who we think could boost their draft stock or be potential first-round picks next year who are not one-and-done freshmen. We're going to talk about that in the second and third segment, but we're going to lead the show talking about West Virginia, the latest news going on over there, of course, after Bob Huggins' resignation. And we got some updates on a handful of different guys. We've talked about a few of them. Some of you everyday listeners know that we talked about Tre Mitchell and his decision to go to Kentucky and what that means for the Wildcats. We've talked a little bit about Kerr Kriisa and his decision to return to West Virginia in kind of all of this madness that has happened following Huggins' departure. And of course, the decision to bring in Josh Eilert with the hope of returning players. It's gone okay. Again, Kriisa coming back is huge, but losing Tre Mitchell hurts. And now you have Joe Toussaint in the portal. You have Mo Wague, in the portal. Leif, are you surprised to see as many guys exploring the portal even after the team decided to keep one of the assistant coaches? Do you think that this is kind of going to be what continues to happen for this team right now?
Yeah, I think the mass exodus was going to happen. Honestly, I was a little bit surprised that it didn't happen when Huggins was in the news a couple months ago, and he was able to retain because Huggins brought in a crazy good recruiting class via the portal. Like the actual recruiting class from high school wasn't tremendous, but you get Jesse Edwards, Kerr Kriisa, you retain guys like Toussaint, and then or you get him, and now you have Mitchell supposed to stay, and then this second cycle of the news cycle for Huggins, and then he leaves. I think that you knew that was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back because he was the reason they went there. And then Kerr Kriisa mentioned hey, I love what West Virginia did, how they embraced me. I'm staying. That's great, but I don't think many people are going to go play for someone that wasn't the recruiting factor. It's a little different than when Duke, you were recruited by Coach K, but you already knew that the next year was going to be Shire. This was a blindsiding move. And so I'm not surprised at all. I think it is big to take someone in-house to retain some talent. But now it's so late in the recruiting cycle, it's going to be really difficult for them to really compile a decent roster. So this West Virginia team, I think, is going to have a difficult time being competitive in the Big 12.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. It seems like they kept Eilert in hopes of retaining their talent, but not necessarily in the hopes of adding a lot of talent. And certainly trying to go out and find another coach in this time in late June would have been really hard. But I wonder how successful they'll be in getting other guys, not just their own returners, but trying to get other guys to fill out the roster if they lose. When you lose a guy like Tre Mitchell, when you lose a guy like Toussaint or Wague, they got to go fill those roster spots somehow. So I think it's going to be a tough battle right now for this West Virginia team to stay afloat. I mean, I think they built a roster that was going to be competitive in the Big 12, and now it's looking like they got some work to do. And I want to pivot a little bit and just talk about the two guys who are available in the portal right now in Toussaint and Wague, who are both getting a significant amount of high major interest around the country. Not surprising at all with Toussaint in particular, a sixth-man guy who averaged 9, 3, and 3 last year for Coach Huggins, and looks like he's got visits coming up to Kansas State and Texas Tech. There's talk about him taking a day trip up to go hang out with Nate Oates at Alabama. He's also got Zoom calls scheduled with Miami and Gonzaga. That is a really, really good list of 5 schools right there for Toussaint. I'm curious your thoughts on that list in general, and maybe some thoughts on where he might fit best out of that group.
I think because he's played sixth man both at Iowa on a good team when they had Luka Garza, Joe Wieskamp, and teams like that, and then on a solid West Virginia team that was an 8-9 seed in the tournament. I guess they're a 9 seed. And they had inclinations of winning that game against Maryland, and they ended up kind of falling apart. But the reason I say that is because he's familiar with a role that would be coveted by those teams. Like they wouldn't ask him to play enormous minutes. They wouldn't ask him to be a top scorer, but he's still an appealing player because he is able to produce in that role and he's comfortable doing so. One other team to mention that I've heard some ties to is Nebraska. Yeah, because that is a place where I think he'd get more run, and later in your career, maybe that's a more appealing thing than going to a team where you're going to be a backup. And so that's the only reason I'd toss them in, even though they're not of the echelon of some of the others. He's a really good defender. For those of you guys who don't know, he's someone who hounds the ball, thrives playing quickly, not a great shooter, decent creator. But I could see him playing well in that type of system where it's pretty free for all. I mean, Fred Hoiberg runs a notoriously if your point guard's got it, let him rock. Like Monte Morris for 4 years at Iowa State, and then they had Bryce McGowan's as a freshman, and McGowan's took some shots. You're like, what in the world are you doing? You got talent, and Hoiberg, you cultivate it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. I think you look at obvious spots where he would be a sixth man and be valued for his defensive instincts, like Miami and Gonzaga both stand out there pretty clearly to me, and where that would be a role for him. Alabama most likely would be his role there, but Grant McCasland has almost hasn't missed on the recruiting trail, and if he visits Texas Tech, it seems like there's a good chance that he could land there.
He feels like a Red Raider.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he?
He gives you that I'm gonna dig in and defend vibe right away, and I think it's an interesting one. Would be Javon Kinnerly entered the portal. So maybe Alabama's looking for someone there. I think Alabama's got so much just influx of talent that he probably doesn't go there and create a logjam, but that's just another factor that makes it interesting.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think this will be a really fun one to track. Him and Mulcahy are kind of the two guards, and Quinterly, of course, are the guards that are really kind of fun to track right now. I mean, it's almost July, and we're still talking about really good players that are available. And then you got a player like Wague, who it's not that he's not a good player. He's just a lot less of a known commodity at this point. He's a guy who started at junior college level, played at West Virginia last year, not a very big role, but he averaged about 4 points, 3 boards. He shot 74% from the field, though. Again, sample size was small, but you still have to kind of tip your hat at somebody who's that effective around the rim, even in a small sample size. It's in the Big 12. That's impressive to do that anywhere. Lots of schools in the mix here. The latest report that I saw was that Kansas State and DePaul were the two schools that seemed to be the most interested, but the rest of the list, Nebraska was on that list as well, Georgetown, Oregon, Alabama again. And I think these are just schools that have reached out and to talk to him. So I don't know the full scope of interest there, but I'm curious for a guy like this, who's a bit less proven, kind of, how you think this portal thing might shake out with him.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to see what someone like that prioritizes, because if he wants an easy pathway to playing, I think West Virginia is the most conducive to that.
Sure.
It's a high major school. Yes, you might have a rebuilding year, but if you want more playing time, why not go to a team that you're familiar with in terms of surrounding?
Sure.
But it's a new coach, and but you do know the coach. So that would probably be where my mind goes if I want to prove myself, because all those other schools, in some way or another, Nebraska is the only one that we listed, maybe DePaul, that aren't better than what West Virginia projects to be. But if you want to get on a better team, you're not going to play not 100% true, but it's just harder to project him playing at any of those places.
Right.
For instance, Kansas State's still got Naquan Tomlin's going to be a starting power forward. I don't see him having that much success right away. So I actually would imagine he might return, just because I think that makes the most logical sense. And it's not like he wasn't recruited initially by the coach who's now the head coach. Huggins obviously was a huge deal in it, but there's Eilert, he made him comfortable there. And a lot of development, for those of you who don't know, in college basketball is done by those assistant coaches with players that are kind of almost red shirts, hardly play. I think that's a comfort. And unless he doesn't like Morgantown, West Virginia, which could happen, then I'd imagine he's going to return.
Well, Leaf, the 2024 NBA draft is like 51 weeks away, basically a full year away, but we already know some of the top guys who are returning to college who we think, at least at this point, could project to be 2024 first-round picks. And we got some of those guys to discuss, including a trio of them from Duke. All of that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Bird Dogs. I don't know how else to say this, folks, so I'm just going to keep it simple. Bird Dogs, short and pants, they make you look good. And the Bird Dogs stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, and they give you a truly sculpted look. In fact, Bird Dogs do the same thing that Lululemon does, but they fit even better. They also fit better than regular shorts made of stiff, restricting cotton. How? Bird Dogs fixed it by inventing cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki but stretches so that you get a slimmer fit without sacrificing movement. It also uses anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the promo code LockedOnCollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedoncollege for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. Bird Dogs, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. Folks, I want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners on YouTube. Coming up this week on Locked On College Basketball, we're going to speak to a Division I head coach about the transfer portal. That's coming on Thursday. Friday, we're going to be discussing some of the biggest storylines from the last year in college sports. We also got some ACC, SEC matchups to discuss as well. So find us wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, check out the show on YouTube as well. Leaf, 2024 NBA draft. It is a long, long ways away, and we still got plenty of incoming freshmen who are going to take up big spots in that draft next year. Isaiah Collier, Aaron Bradshaw, if he gets healthy, DJ Wagner, et cetera, plenty of guys to keep an eye on as the college basketball season starts. But I want to talk about guys who chose to return to school or guys who maybe didn't really have NBA draft aspirations last year, but who we think might pop in a way that they end up in that first round conversation next season. And I want to start with Duke because Duke had a noticeable offseason in terms of players returning to school who others thought maybe weren't going to do that. And I think at this point, it's reasonable to expect that they could have up to 3, probably at least 2 of their returning players in the first round next season. Of course, that group includes Tyrese Proctor. It includes Kyle Filipowski. It includes Mark Mitchell in terms of the sophomore groups. I want to start with those 3, Leaf, and just kind of get a sense of maybe what those guys need to work on in order to be in that first round conversation. And again, knowing that we're a year out, how likely it is that those guys will end up being in that conversation come June next year.
Yeah, Duke to me was a top 10 caliber team for the tail end of the season. Like metrics would support that. For the last 15 games of the season, I believe Duke was top 10 in offense and defense on KenPom. We talked a lot, you, me, and Isaac, about how if a team's top 20 in both categories, that typically is an indication of a Final Four contender. So what changed in those final 15 games? Derek Lively got healthier, but really what changed was Tyrese Proctor became that dude. He was the best player on Duke. People could say, he wasn't first team. Filipowski was. Filipowski was the rookie there. If you watch them play, Tyrese Proctor was that dude. And so I think he, along with the guy that I'm going to mention later, I'm really excited about, are the 2 guys that I think from this draft class, from the 2024 draft class that I anticipate to be there, that are returners, are my favorite. What he can work on is pretty simple. He just needs to score with the ball a little more. Like he's so pass first, and he's such a good defender. He's the best defender on that team other than Lively, but that's a very different defensive player. And the other thing is he scored when Duke needed it against Tennessee, against that really tough physical defense, and they lost. Proctor was scoring, and you're like, oh my goodness, he could go to the draft and be picked first round this time. He's a great passer. His shooting started off horribly, absolutely horribly. If you look at the last 20 games, very good. So honestly, he just needs to continue shooting well, not exceptionally, but well, and just score a little bit on pick and roll for himself and continue to create. And I think he's a top 15 pick.
Let's talk about Filipowski, because I'm with you 100% on Proctor. I think that the odds of him being a lottery pick next year are fairly high in terms of as much as you can project a returner from college to be a lottery pick, because as we saw this year, there weren't a whole lot of them, but Proctor is certainly a young guy who's got the appeal, especially if that shooting is more consistent. But I want to talk about Filipowski, a guy who was mocked in the first round kind of throughout last season. At the start of the season, he was mocked in the first round, and he kind of stayed in that first round conversation, had himself obviously a very productive season, as you alluded to earlier. And then he kind of surprised a lot of people by choosing to return. Were you surprised to see that? And do you think that it's a decision that could end up helping him in terms of his draft stock for next season?
I actually was expecting him to return because personally I was lower. And I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, but I thought that what he did well is very good in college, but his game wasn't tailored to the NBA. And right now, so much of that, like if you're not going to be a lottery guy, it's like, okay, how do you fit into what the NBA prioritizes? Because you'd be going to a winning team in most likelihood. So what I think he needs to do is he shot well, like he's a good shooter, but he didn't shoot well. So what he's got to do is just, shoot better from three and catch and shoot situations, work a little bit on switching on defense because he's a 4, he's not a 5. And so that's going to be big is when you're 7 foot as a 4, you're going to have to be able to be nimble and slide your feet because he's not like a true rim protector either. So what he has to do is just become a little better defensively, shoot a little better of a percentage, and he's still going to have a high usage. But I don't think he's quite like Matthew Hurt, which is the kind of the last stretch 4 from Duke that was really good in college after his sophomore year. But his game just couldn't translate because he's an on-ball, tough shot creator with no athleticism defensively. Filipowski's a better athlete. He's more functional and a little tougher than Matthew Hurt. But I think the same logic applies. He needs to get better defensively and knock down more shots. And I anticipate he will do so.
The other returner that I think kind of caused some waves, I mean, obviously Jeremy Roach, that was a huge returnee for him. I don't think that Roach is a first round guy necessarily, though he could end up being a draftable guy. But the big one is Mark Mitchell. You have Filipowski and Proctor are going to get more of the attention, and Mitchell was a bit more of a kind of traditional glue guy, I suppose. But we're talking about a strong 6'8" forward who shot 35% from deep last year, averaged just under 10 points per game, coming back for another year. What are your thoughts about him? Is the size kind of a concern? Is he not big enough? Kind of where do you think he could potentially fit in this mix for next season?
Well, his concern to me is anything but like the measurable. He's super athletic. He's going to play good team basketball. His shot's really, really funky. Like he's got this low line drive laser release with his left hand. And so my concern with him is just, can he shoot at a level that allows him to be on an NBA basketball court? Like if you were to look at some of the guys that were picked at the tail end of this year's draft or early in the second, that said, you look at a guy like Jordan Walsh. I think Walsh is a better shooter than Mark Mitchell, despite numbers not indicating it. Just like that's my eye test. And he went into the early second, excuse me. How about Julian Phillips, who I think is a comparable athlete to Mark Mitchell, shot 82% from the free throw line. I think he'll be a steal, but he went in the mid-second. I just think the role in an NBA, it's so hard to be a specialist on one side of the floor, and that they're valuing shooting and decent defense over amazing defense and like slightly below decent shooting. So it's a little flip. The script has flipped a little bit. I mean, that's why you're seeing like Isaac Okoro and the Cavs desperately want to get another wing because he's a tremendous defender. He just can't shoot. When you got Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland creating all this havoc, and then you play 2 bigs, you need someone to space the floor. And I think that's just like the obvious example that pops in my head of why Mark Mitchell's going to have a tough time. So he's really got to be in the lab shooting threes.
Well, I know you got one guy left in the ACC that you wanted to talk about, a guy that certainly doesn't have as much fanfare as those Duke guys. And our eagle-eyed or eagle-watching listeners will know that Leaf has an affinity for Virginia. So, of course, we're going to talk about Ryan Dunn coming back for his sophomore year at Virginia. Didn't have a huge role last year. Of course, a lot of guys don't have a ton of points per game when they play at Virginia just because Virginia doesn't have that many offensive possessions. But Dunn's a 6'8" guard. Lots of things to like about him, and I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on why you think this could be a guy who's in the first round or at least drafted next season.
Yeah, I expect him to really surprise people this year. The Virginia team had veterans up front. Jaden Gardner and Ben Vanderplas were 5th-year power forwards, and they kind of played foils for one another. One stretched the floor, one banged on the inside. But Ryan Dunn would come in and play like 3 through 5. And I think there's an argument he could play 2 through 4 in the NBA. So you just talk about versatility. He's got that in spades. Absolutely phenomenal vertical athlete. Someone that even in a limited role, knew what to do in different roles. And I think that's really important when you're a freshman playing on a veteran team. And then the other thing is, you score limited points for Virginia anyway, but players from Virginia, even with those limited like counting stats, have made big strides in the NBA because the athleticism is allowed to be more apparent. So I think Virginia is going to play faster this year, just personnel wise. Reese Beekman, I also think could be in this discussion, and he's one of my favorite players in college basketball. I don't hide that. But the reason Dunn, I think, is the one that stands out to me is you can't teach 6'8" with his defense is unbelievable. Like, he might be the best defensive recruit Tony Bennett's ever had. And I don't say that lightly because DeAndre Hunter was unreal. And so everyone around Virginia says, oh, he's baby DeAndre Hunter. If you guys remember, DeAndre Hunter did not play. He was a redshirt. Then he was the sixth man on the 1 seed that lost to UMBC. So then DeAndre Hunter comes in his redshirt sophomore year, and he's unreal, and they win a national championship. I don't expect that same meteoric rise for Dunn. I just think he's got more work to do on the ball than Hunter did. But I think defensively, and if he shoots 35% from three, which I don't think is that crazy, he could be an 11-point, 8 rebound, 2 steals, couple assists, 35% from three, 75 from the line, and be picked 20th in the draft. I really think he's got that in his bag.
Well, there are some non-ACC guys returning to college next year, including a pair of guys in the Big East, one in the Pac-12, one in the SEC that we want to talk here to close out the show, coming up right after this. All right, Leaf, segment 3 here, still talking about players returning to college for the 2023-2024 season, who we think could boost their draft stock or at least put their draft stock into the first round conversation for 2024. Talked about a couple of guys from Duke as well as Ryan Dunn from Virginia there. Now we're going to close out the show talking about a pair of guys in the Big East in Trey Alexander from Creighton and Donovan Clingan from UConn. Of course, Clingan was kind of that Philip Petrusev, Drew Timme situation where you kind of push a guy out into Adama Sanogo. And I don't know that he was fully pushed out necessarily, but I think a lot of people at UConn knew that Clingan was going to be the guy next season. And Sanogo, of course, finds himself in the NBA, signed himself a contract. I can't remember where, but I know he signed somewhere. And now you got Clingan who could kind of take over for the defending champs. And I'm curious your thoughts on what he could or needs to do or will do in your mind to put himself in that conversation for next season.
Well, I think for Clingan, you saw him come in for Sanogo and UConn go on runs. And so you started to realize, man, this guy's really good. He also happens to be huge and nimble. And so if you give him more run, I think he's really, really will thrive. Maybe his per minute stats would go down just because that's normal. But the appeal is basically, okay, Walker Kessler comes into the Jazz. And I'm a Jazz fan, but this is not a pitch I've made. This is what I've been told. Walker Kessler goes to the Jazz, protects the rim, runs the floor, runs pick and roll, and just uses his size and coordination to make an enormous role. Walker Kessler is a tremendous defender at the NBA level. Clingan's not quite that yet, but at the college level, he's a really good defender. Basically, the idea is he could have been drafted in the first round this year, and you just project him for the next year. So now that he comes back, he's going to hone his skills, have a bigger role. I fully expect him to go in the top 20 of the next year's draft because he's going to be big. He's going to be well above average athleticism for that height. He's going to impact the game near the rim on both sides. He's got vertical lob gravity. He defends the rim. And honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if he can step out and shoot the ball because his touch is really, really good. I'm not saying that's something I expect UConn to show, but I bet in the draft cycle next year, they're going to be like, hey, you want to go shoot some threes in the star drill? And if you shoot 15 out of 25, maybe even 17 out of 25, we're going to sit you out the rest of the way. You're not going to do any workouts. And there you go. That's kind of what I see happening.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how bigs are treated next year because this year, I mean, obviously you had Derek Lively go early, but it was, obviously Wembanyama, but there wasn't a lot of college bigs in this draft. And certainly there was a lot of guys, the Sheebways, the Timmies, who we kind of knew weren't going to get a lot of attention. Clingan is in a different category than those guys, but it'll be interesting to see how the big man thing overall shakes out. And there's another big that we're going to talk about here before we get to Trey Alexander. I know I teased him, but since we're talking about bigs, I kind of want to talk about Adem Bona from UCLA as well, a guy who was a pretty late decision to return to school. A lot of conversation about him being a late first, early second round pick last year. Obviously the shoulder injury kind of derailed his performance towards the end of the season, which probably would have helped boost his stock even more. And I'm curious coming back to a UCLA team that lost a lot of talent from last year. Seems like there could be room for him to have a bigger role next year at UCLA. Do you see a potential breakout with him?
Yeah, I think the appeal for him is tremendous defender, energy big,
Yeah.
someone that it kind of reminds me of like the appeal of Bismack Biyombo. I think there's a chance he's better offensively, and he probably will be. But just imagine tremendous energy, big, able to defend the rim and run at a level that bigs shouldn't be able to do.
Yeah.
I actually was surprised he returned to school. That was one of the few that surprised me. I think for the most part, I was pretty spot on who's going to return, who's not. That one surprised me. And I think UCLA lost Jaime Jaquez. Tiger Campbell's no longer the stalwart there. Like, what are you going to get from UCLA? There's some European influx now coming in, both via the transfer portal and Lazar Stefanovic and in recruiting. So I think there's a chance that they're going to play a more egalitarian system that is catered to playing inside out. And I think Bona will show he's got more than what he demonstrated as a freshman because of more opportunity. And defensively, he's just going to be phenomenal. He's going to get better. He's going to get faster. And the refined offensive skills will make him an appealing prospect.
Yeah. I'm all in on Adem Bona. I think he's going to be a really, really big riser around college basketball next season. And kind of like what Trey Alexander was last year. And when you see guys kind of pop in their sophomore year and have a big uptick in production and in efficiency, all that stuff, they tend to stay in the draft. And I mean, Alexander went from shooting 28% as a freshman to 41% as a sophomore from three. He almost doubled his points per game. And he decided to come back for another year with the Blue Jays, of course, a Creighton team that lost Ryan Nembhard in the transfer portal, lost Arthur Kaluma in the transfer portal, do get Baylor Shireman back, do get Ryan Kalkbrenner back, get Stephen Ashworth from Utah State. So I think this is going to be a solid team next year. And it seems like Alexander should be able to step into an even bigger role. Is that why you think he returned to school? Was this another one that surprised you, or did you see this coming with him?
I was surprised because I saw him at the combine, and the first day he looked solid but unspectacular, and I was like, okay, like there was nothing alarming here. Whereas if like he was really good, he was going to stay in. If he was not very good, then he was going to go back. What surprised me is when he measured, he had a 6'10" wingspan, which I was like, oh, maybe he's going to get more looks at being like this jumbo guard. Why I think it's probably smart that he returned. Hiccups, excuse me. Why I think it's smart that he returned is I think he'll play the point guard. Ashworth is listed as the point guard, but Ashworth is a tremendous shooter. He's actually in my high school graduating class in Utah, and I was looking up the stat sheets, and I was like, man, this guy's ridiculous. So we didn't play against each other, but I've been keenly aware of Stephen Ashworth for a long time. But my point being is he's a great shooter. He's not the point guard. So I think Trey Alexander is going to make himself more appealing by being a plus-size creator, someone defensively who's pretty good, going to get better, and he's just got this ability to score from the mid-range. Like his shooting splits were great. Catch and shoot from three, mid-range was through the charts. And now if he becomes a better passer, runs the pick and roll with Nembhard gone now, like, I mean, he was a great facilitator, and you guys are lucky to have him.
Yes.
So now I think he'll get those lobs to Kalkbrenner. And I saw Creighton play in person twice at March Madness, and they run beautiful stuff. So I think that'll make him look like a really good creator, and then it'll help him accelerate that process.
Last guy on our list here from the SEC, an SEC all-freshman performer last year. And we know that those SEC all-freshman team are very hard to make because they tend to have a lot of really, really talented players. That is Florida guard Riley Kugel. Kugel from Orlando, 6'5" guard for Todd Golden last year, about 10 points per game, about a little under 38% from deep. Todd Golden's got a really, really rich history of developing guards going back to his time at San Francisco. And this seems like a guy that you're excited to see what he can do in year two.
This is my favorite player of any of we've talked about. I had him top 20 in this class. I think I had him 16 before he withdrew his name. He withdrew early, and I mean, this could backfire, but I feel really confident. I would have had him in my lottery this year, and this year's class is significantly better than next year's. Riley Kugel, top 10 pick. You heard it here first. What's the appeal? Athletic, shot creator. They had Colin Castleton. Castleton goes down, and he becomes a 20 a game scorer. So when Castleton goes down, every focus shifts to a freshman who wasn't used to that role. At the beginning of the year, was barely getting enough shots to make him like recognizable in scouting reports. And then he's shooting these step back threes that the shot selection wasn't necessarily good and his percentages were okay. But you watch those games and you're like, my goodness, like he's got this irrational confidence to be a shot maker and a shot taker and a shot maker. And he did so with no help, really. That Florida team was not very good outside of Castleton and Kugel. And so now you're going to have a better team, a more talented one, someone where the offense is catered to him. He's going to get better at shooting just normal shots, and he's going to be able to go downhill more frequently. I think there's a chance that he's this year's Benedict Mathurin, where after Matherin's freshman year, you saw flashes. And I actually had him top 20 the year before he was drafted. Then he comes back to school his sophomore year. He's the best player in the Pac-12, and it's not even close. And he goes number 6 in the draft. I'm not saying Kugel goes top 6. I think he's closer to 10 to 14, but I'm gonna say the top 10 thing I said. And I think he's going to be an SEC first-team player. I think he could threaten for SEC Player of the Year. And I could see him being a top 10 pick where people say, you know what? This is a shooting guard of our future.
Wow. That is some bold stuff, and I love it. I love every second of it, Leaf. We're going to call it there. That was fantastic. Appreciate your time and insight as always. We will have many more conversations about the 2024 NBA draft class over the next 50 weeks, but appreciate a first glance at it right now.